Okay, so I guess it's after 9:45. So I'm Marc Fisher. I'm going to be talking about a framework library that I've been working on at Google called PageLoader. So basically, and this is actually going to be a pretty short talk. So PageLoader is based on some of the ideas out of the Page Factory stuff that comes with WebDriver, Selenium. The idea of having annotated fields on classes that will be bound to web elements somewhat automatically. But what I ran into as I was trying to use that to model our pages is that there's a lot of boilerplate that I didn't like, and then there was a lot of, it was hard to model certain types of pages. And so I extended that idea and created PageLoader. So actually the first thing I did is that we use Guice a lot in the teams I'm working with, so actually my framework is very tied to Guice and fully supports Guice and allows you to inject things into your page objects directly, and it works how you would expect. So in this case, I've injected a page loader and a WebDriver, and I can do something like this in my page object, go to home, which would do driver find element by ID, and then go to home. And when you create the instance of campaigns page, those injected values will just be set for you. And as I said, one of the things that I ran into that I didn't like was all the boilerplate on is loaded. Generally speaking, what we found with the developers I was working with is their expectation was that if they had an annotated element, that element was present and visible in the page at the time that the page object was created. And so I actually no longer have isLoaded methods on my page objects. I actually don't have to extend or implement any existing interface with them either, is another advantage of this. And when you do something like loader.getInstance campaigns page class there, it won't return until it's been able to find all of the elements and they're actually visible in the page that have been defined there. And so that has helped to, basically what we found is that really did match our users' expectations better. Another thing that we came across is, yeah?
Is it possible it'll hang if it can't,
it uses timeout mechanisms, and so, and actually you can control the length of the timeouts via the Guice injection stuff. So by default, it's going to wait 5 seconds. Yeah?
What happens if you have some elements on your page that are only conditionally visible?
I have solutions for that later. Another thing we found is that we saw sort of these patterns in what find bys look like. So for example, maybe your application is inserting its own attributes, debug IDs attribute on the elements to identify these elements, and so you're going to end up with a lot of find bys that look like this sort of ugly looking XPath, or you could do it as a CSS selector, but it's similarly ugly looking. So I actually included a mechanism to create your own custom annotations that work similar to the find by, but then have semantics that you can define. And it's actually pretty simple. This is pretty much what the implementation of this debug ID would look like. You have an annotation that you just annotate with this fact that it's a find by annotation, and then a reference to the class that corresponds to the implementation of it. And then your implementation just has to implement this finder interface where you can, in find element, do whatever you want to. And actually, this also allows for much more complex find by annotations that are, so for example, you can find one annotation I had written one point in time, you would have labels that you'd have label elements that referred to another form element in the page, right? And so you could find by the value of the label element and have that actually return the form element. And so you can do more complicated and interesting sort of logic inside the find element, find out methods there. And then you end up with nice looking annotations that are meaningful for your particular application. Another aspect is hierarchical page objects. And so if you listen to the HTML elements lightning talk yesterday, they also have support for this, I think. But I took a slightly different approach here. And the basic idea is that, and so as we know, our web pages are hierarchical in structure, right? They're a tree. And so what you want to be able to do is create objects that correspond to that, and then this actually gives you the ability to reuse those components later. So you have this class myTab that's going to correspond to the tab section of this page, and wherever you want to use that, you can use it, and you can use it in different, like I said, different contexts for reuse, because the find by that indicates where this is going to start searching, or the scope for the search is defined where it's used. So up there where you see the find by class name awdetail myTab, that means that all the find bys that are going to occur inside the myTab will be scoped to the portion of the page, to the web element that matches that find by above. And so we're really just trying to take advantage of how WebDriver provides us this scoping mechanism already for searching for elements within an element, right? And similarly, you can keep extending that arbitrarily deep, and it's going to continue to work the same way. And the loader.getInstance calls will make sure that basically that whole object graph has been built before it returns. Another thing we saw is that there's often sort of repeated elements or lists of elements type things. So you have a table and it has a bunch of rows. It's an arbitrary number of rows. You don't know ahead of time if it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 10 necessarily. You want your page objects to be generalizable to however many rows you're going to have in your page, right? And so you can actually, the box should have been lower probably, but you can actually have a field that's of type list of whatever, list of web element or list of some other page object, and it will populate that with an element for every element that's found with the find elements call based on the find by up above. So I didn't show it on the custom annotation. Your custom annotations finders class actually have both a find element and a find elements that you have to implement. And so find elements is used for lists. And so that gives you that ability to have these repeated elements and have a nice general page object that'll work across this table regardless of how many rows it is. And then in this case, this table is the rows in here, and the order of the rows and actually the number of the rows will update dynamically via JavaScript events as the user interacts with the page, right? And you don't necessarily want to, it doesn't necessarily make sense to recreate that entire page object structure. And so you can actually define something as being, a field as being lazy. And that gives you the ability, it gives you the ability to handle the problem. What if you have elements that might not be in the page? So lazy elements don't block, so it won't load the lazy elements at the time of page creation. It waits until you call get on that interface. So the lazy interface just has one method, get. And it actually will recalculate this every time you call get. So it works sort of like if you had disabled caching in Page Factory, if you've looked at that. So with Page Factory, it actually always lazily loads its elements the first time you, if you use the default configuration for it. The first time you access an element, That element is actually just a proxy that will lazily do the find. So lazy works sort of like that, except for I made it explicit where it was, except that with Page Factory, it will try to cache that value and reuse it later on, and I don't do any caching here. So this will reload the set of rows every time you call get on here, which means that if this row order changes or something, it'll be accurately reflected inside this list that when you call get. And so yeah, like I said, they don't block the loading of the page, will be reloaded. And so these are useful for pop-up type things, as well as also these sections of the DOM that are likely to dynamically change. Another thing that was sort of user-driven is we found that there were times when you actually need to sort of go up the hierarchy in your page object structure. So in this case, I have this table which has this row class, and the row class is bound to tr, right, inside this table. And really what we want to be able to get is to the header name, so we know for a column what that column's name is. But to get that, the headers are bound up in the myTable object. And so what you can do is there's actually a parent annotation that gives you a reference back to your enclosing page object if you have one. And so that each time, for every row instance, it will have its parent, in this case, bound to the instance of myTable that it belongs to. And then so that then you can change that, or you can implement that get cell name by going up to the parent, getting its header for the particular column that you're interested in, and returning that. And there's some other features that I decided not to cover here. So currently, PageLoader actually is unfortunately Google internal. My goal is to open source it next quarter or the following quarter at the latest, hopefully. But I have to figure out how to do that. I haven't done the process at Google yet of open sourcing internal stuff, but I don't see that there should be any hangups. There's no real interesting or proprietary technology involved in any of this. And then another thing that I didn't cover here is I've been working on a extension for Chrome that will help you generate a lot of that boilerplate of the find by and the overall structure. So going back to what Simon was saying, I don't advocate that you do anything that generates your entire page object, but generating the portions of the implementation is definitely something that I think we can do well through a sort of interactive Chrome extension that I've been building. Any questions?
Am I allowed to use your principles and do it on my own?
I don't know why you wouldn't be.
I'll look your email, because there's some things there that
Did you have a question?
Since you can't open source it yet, can we go through it again and get more details?
Sure. What do you want to know?
Okay, the annotations,
So,
you show how you implement your annotations.
yeah, so this, as I said, basically the annotation you implement is a regular annotation. You can have properties on it that correspond to what you want to set it for. So in this case, for the debug ID annotation, I only have one attribute that I'm setting, which is the value that's going to be used. And then what happens is, internally what PageLoader is doing is when it sees this annotation, it creates a new instance of the annotation class as specified by that find by annotation that's on the meta annotation there, right? So it uses Juice to create a new instance of that. So that debug ID finder just needs to be Juice creatable in some sense.
So you have to have a PageLoader object to interpret the annotations, kind of like
The PageLoader class interprets these annotations, yeah. But it's all based on this, on that relationship. It's just on the relationship that's defined between the annotation and the finder for that annotation. And so then the finder, so what it does is it creates that, then it calls set annotation with the actual instance of the annotation that you're doing so that it can get like the value or whatever for the attributes. And then whenever it goes to creating an actual page object, right, it will see a field that it needs to be set, and it calls either find element or find elements, depending upon if it's a list field or not. And sets, and then which is responsible, so you just implement that however you want to. And it's passed in the search context, which corresponds to the scope for the page object you're currently working on.
when you're doing the hierarchical showing like you have the frame thing.
Right.
I wasn't sure on your annotation how you.
That has to do with the search context that's passed into the find element or find elements calls. So those will be the web element that corresponds to your current place in the hierarchy. Or if it's the outermost page object, it's WebDriver itself. So search context is just an interface that's implemented by both. Yeah.
Oh, and when you do open source it, how are you going to let us know?
I don't know. I honestly don't know the community well enough to, but I interact a lot with the people at Google who work on WebDriver, and so I will discuss with them how it's best to allow that information to propagate out. So, is there? Yeah. So, probably yeah, along that line. Any other questions?
Do you have any documentation on this process on the web? Because not everyone uses there's other frameworks, dependency injection frameworks, Spring or
So, what would you want the documentation to cover?
I mean, just basically, I know this, most of this that I see is just geared towards.
It's just what?
It seems like the documentation is only geared towards Juice.
Currently, PageLoader requires Juice at the moment. My implementation, when I plan on open sourcing, requires Juice, just because, well, it's the only dependency injection framework I've spent a significant amount of time in, is one aspect of it. And to support something else, I would have to get access to whatever their equivalent is to an injector to be able to create the instances. So, for example, if I were trying to do this, the only other one, dependency injection framework that I've even looked at at all is Dagger, and so I don't know that this would even be possible in Dagger because I don't think it has an equivalent to Injector because it uses code generation primarily to handle its dependency injection. Other frameworks, as long as you had access to something to create instances of arbitrary classes, you would. I've considered how to try to abstract away that module, that piece of functionality, so that it would be pluggable. But and that would be a good thing when I open source it for somebody to start contributing on. Yeah.
Just because I have experience with Spring, which might be more heavyweight, is just dependency injection and not all the other peripheral stuff.
Juice is just dependency injection, yeah. So it's actually what more or less the reference for also for like JSR 330 annotations. It was the basis for what came in there, although that only really covers the basic structure of what something, what stuff could work across multiple dependency injection frameworks, and then.
And if we were to write on, like, let's say if I was a Java programmer, where would I learn all the cool Java-ness of the stuff that you're doing? Like, does
It's through basically through just reflection APIs. This is the main thing I'm accessing. So if you learn the reflection APIs and how to access annotations at runtime, and then spend a little bit of time learning how Juice creates instances and stuff.
if you're a row, you can find out who your parent table is.
Yeah. In that case, yeah, it's just actually was something I added relatively recently, and I just pass in to the calls what the parent objects are when I create the sub objects and set them directly. Anything else? Okay.